Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first colloquium in 2021. I will wait a minute before I get started. In the meanwhile, feel free to say hi in chat. That is where you'll be posting your questions to the right of this video. Please keep in mind you have to be signing into your personal Gmail account. When you leave a question, it asks you to create a channel. That's just a YouTube account, which is a subset of a Google account. It's not really a channel, and not much will be changed in your account. You're welcome to delete it later if you don't like it. Also, your questions will be cut off because there's character limits in how YouTube allows you to send chats. I'll just concatenate them in my head when I'm reading off the questions. So feel free to post your question during the talk and after the talk, and I'll read them off to our guest. Today's talk is at an exceptional time. Next week, we'll get back to our noon Mountain Time, that is 2 p.m. East Coast time, and we'll host most of the talks here on YouTube. Next week at noon on Friday, we actually have Dr. Monica Hooper from the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities. And her talk is entitled Racial Ethnic Disparities in the Age of COVID-19, Heightened Emphasis on Long-Standing Problems. So that's coming up next week. You can subscribe on YouTube and add the calendar entry on our website, and I'll see you next week for that one. But today, I am privileged to introduce Dr. Lance Freeman, professor in urban planning from Columbia University, who has accepted our invite for this talk. I should perhaps introduce myself. I'm just hosting this talk. I'm not the speaker. My name is Murtaza Karimzadeh. I'm an assistant professor of geography here at CU Boulder. But back to our guest, Dr. Lance Freeman, who's a professor in urban planning at Columbia University in New York City. His research focuses on affordable housing, gentrification, ethnic and racial stratification in housing markets, and the relationship between the built environment and well-being. Professor Freeman teaches courses in community development, housing policy, and research methods. And he has published several books and articles, but most notably, he's the author of the book, There Goes the Hood, Views of Gentrification from the Ground Up by Temple University Press, and A Haven and a Hail, The Ghetto in Black America by Columbia University Press. Dr. Freeman also obtained extensive experience working with the community development groups while working as a community development coordinator for the North Carolina Institute of Minority Economic Development and as a research associate at the Center for Urban and Regional Studies in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Obviously, we are very privileged to have him. Let me invite Dr. Freeman to present his talk entitled, Where Do They Go? Displacement and Destinations Among Residents of Gentrifying Neighborhoods. Dr. Freeman, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share some of my most recent research with you all. I'm really excited about this opportunity. So this is work that I'm working on with several co-authors, Jacqueline Huang, who's a sociologist at Stanford University, Tyler Harpert, who is my graduate student at Columbia University, and also Iris Zhang, who's also a graduate student in sociology at Stanford University. So the topic of gentrification is one that many of you probably are familiar with. It stirs up heated emotions. It's oftentimes served as the impetus for protests, such as this slot picture here. This article here published talks about the poor being pushed out of certain neighborhoods in Denver. So it is a topic that captures a lot of attention, both in academia and in the media. And a lot of the concern is about how gentrification impacts residents, say the original or long-term residents, particularly the poorer, low-income residents of these neighborhoods. And so for that reason, it's something has a certain negative connotation oftentimes. Now, when we talk about gentrification, I have on this slide a couple of definitions, one by the late Neil Smith, who described it as a process by which central urban neighborhoods that have undergone disinvestments and economic decline experience a reversal, reinvestment, and the immigration of relatively well-off middle and upper class population. And the term actually was initially coined by a British sociologist in the 1960s, right? So it actually dates back at least a half a century. And she used the term to describe what was happening in certain neighborhoods in London at that time. And she was, she was observing how upper and middle class households were invading working class quarters. And she used the term gentrification to describe that process. So historically, when gentrification sort of crossed the Atlantic, or at least the term did, and people started paying attention to it, it captured significant attention. I can't see my audience, but I imagine most of you are too young to remember the so-called urban crisis that gripped many American cities in the middle of the 20th century. So when gentrification started capturing people's attention, sometimes called brownstoning or back to the city movement, it ran counter to the prevailing narrative of urban crisis. So in the United States, at least, the 1960s was a period of significant urban unrest. It was the period of perhaps the zenith of white flight. Many whites and middle class families were fleeing central cities. And so gentrification really ran counter to that larger narrative, right? And so it was seen as a term that another geographer coined, Brian Berry, that it was islands of renewal and seas of decay. That's because so many urban centers were decaying, at least losing population, experiencing disinvestment, and gentrification was a reversal of that. So initially, given the backdrop of urban crisis, white flight, urban unrest, many people welcomed gentrification because it was seen perhaps as an opportunity to reverse those trends of disinvestment and white flight, right? It would increase the tax base, it could reverse middle class flight, and it could attract investment. Yet at the same time, even at this early time, there were people who were fearful of displacement. So this type of change attracted significant debate. There was significant debate about the causes of gentrification, and geographers played a central role in that debate, actually. In particular, Marxist geographers like Neil Smith debated the causes of gentrification being something driven by capital versus folks like David Ley, who argued it was more of a cultural phenomena or a demand side phenomena, meaning that as individuals' tastes changed, as people, particularly say young adults, young childless adults, as they grew tired or were not drawn to the suburbs, they decided to live in the city instead, right? So there were these debates about the causes of gentrification and also about the extent to which gentrification displaces the poor, right? So that these were some of the early debates that were taking place in the latter decades of the 20th century. Now, for a number of reasons, but in particular, a lack of data that would allow researchers to really answer the question, we really didn't have a good handle on the extent to which gentrification was associated with displacement, right? We didn't have good longitudinal data or micro level data that would allow you to follow people over time. And so I'll go off on a tangent a little bit in terms of my own scholarly background. I started writing about this topic almost 20 years ago now. So it was in the first years of this century. And at that time, the assumption was gentrification certainly causes widespread displacement, but there weren't good measures of how much displacement was occurring. And the reasons, as I just mentioned, were because we didn't really have good data that would allow us to answer that question. And then also the question of, where do people go if they are displaced? Again, that's something that we really didn't have good data to answer that question. So that's kind of the backdrop. Motivating this research, working with my co-authors, is that, at least even despite the Great Recession, there still has been a significant uptick in gentrification. So for example, many large American cities have experienced large increases in the number of young professionals living near their central business district. Another finding by one of my co-authors is that neighborhoods close to downtown have been increasing in socioeconomic status since the 1970s, and this is increasing since 2000. Now, I will say that, in the midst of this pandemic, these trends may be totally upended. It's too early to tell if some of the patterns that we've been seeing since last year are just temporary blips, or if the pandemic is really going to completely upend some of the patterns that I have just been talking about. And I'm happy to speculate on that in the Q&A section. But I'll put that, that's kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the back of the room. I'll put that to the aside for now and just focus on the fact that, at least up until last year, gentrification was becoming more widespread in American cities during this century. So that's kind of what has motivated this research. Now, there have been, starting, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there has been research, sort of a second wave, a third wave of research on gentrification that has attempted to actually measure how much displacement was occurring. And myself, I've done some of that research. Most of this research differs from the earlier research because it has been able to make use of longitudinal data sets and micro level data sets that allow you to follow individuals that were not available in the 1970s and 1980s when the first wave of gentrification research was occurring. Now, somewhat counterintuitively, most of this research has not been able to document widespread residential mobility and, by inference, displacement that we would associate with gentrification. And I just have here listed several of these studies. Most of these studies, the general approach that they have taken is to compare people living in a gentrifying neighborhood to people living in an otherwise similar low-income neighborhood that is not experiencing gentrification. And then see, do we see more evidence of people moving out of the gentrifying neighborhoods, particularly low-income households or poor households? Do we see more evidence of displacement? And for the most part, these studies that I have listed on this slide here do not find that. Now, it's also worth noting that most of these studies rely on data from the latter part of the 20th century, the 1980s and 1990s. So for example, the study I did with Frank Bracconi that was published in 2004, that relies on data in New York City in the 1990s. So now we're in the third decade of the 21st century. So, that research is somewhat dated at this point. So we're also this research that I'm sharing with you this afternoon is also motivated in part by a desire to update some of these earlier studies and see, well, this was a pattern that these earlier studies found, looking at data mostly from the 1980s and 90s. But what happens if we look at data more recently from this century, for example? Okay, so that sort of motivates the questions, for the research I'm sharing with you now. Is gentrification associated with displacement? And then where do the residents go, residents of gentrifying neighborhoods go? Again, those are, particularly the second question is one we really haven't seen much research that has tried to get a handle on that, despite the substantial attention that gentrification draws. It is relatively understudied in terms of being able to say, well, people are going here or there. And, I think from the perspective of equity, these are important questions. Obviously, the question of displacement is important if people are being forced to move or feel like they have to move at an elevated rate due to gentrification. That obviously has important equity implications. If people, once they leave gentrifying neighborhoods, if they end up moving to poorer neighborhoods or more disadvantaged neighborhoods, that also, I think, has important equity implications. So I think as much as, some people might celebrate certain aspects of gentrification, there are potentially some really important equity implications associated with it, displacement and, where are people going? And as I said, there has been some research on displacement, not much though on figuring out where people are actually going. So I hope that this research can contribute to our understanding by attempting to tackle these two questions. Okay, so here I'm going to get into the methodology. I'm just going to give a brief overview. Happy to talk again the question and answers in more detail. I understand some of the students are taking a methodology class, so I could talk about that in more detail if there is interest during the Q&A. So what we did here is we take data from the 2000 decennial census and the 2013 to 2017 wave of the American Community Survey. And we merged that with a longitudinal survey known as the Panel Study of Income Dynamics. Which I will refer to as the PSID. That's actually a really rich data set. This is a survey that started during the War on Poverty in the 1960s. So it started in 1968. They started interviewing families. And they followed the families and their offspring and even their offspring's offspring, and they're still doing it. So the survey now has 50 years of data going back to 1968. So you can really answer some really interesting questions. It's probably, not probably, as far as I know, it's the richest longitudinal data set in the world, as far as I know. So it's a really rich source of data. Here, we make use of a version that allows you to not only follow the families, but to also identify the census tract that the family is living in. Those of you, I'm not sure how many, if you all are familiar with census terminology, excuse me, a census tract is a statistical unit of geography created by the Census Bureau of about 4,000 or 5,000 people. So it's supposed to approximate a neighborhood, for example. So we have this data. We have families in this survey, and it's a representative sample for the most part of Americans, and we are able to see what census tract they live in. And we're able to follow them over time. And so we're focusing on this century in this particular study, although potentially we could go back even further if we so chose to. Okay, so we know the census tract that the household is living in. So now we have to determine which census tracts do we think are gentrifying, right? So our approach first is to say, well, we would like to compare households that are in gentrifying neighborhoods to households in otherwise similar neighborhoods that don't experience gentrification. And so if you remember the definition of gentrification that I put up earlier in the presentation, gentrification is a process where you have a poorer neighborhood that has experienced disinvestment that now is experiencing a reversal. So the first concept that we use is what we say is gentrifiable, right? So the neighborhood has to be, relatively poor or relatively disadvantaged in order for it to be gentrifiable, right? If the neighborhood is already affluent or middle class, then we would not consider that to be gentrifiable. So we're really focusing on neighborhoods at the start of our study period that are relatively low income. And so we use two different metrics, one that I had developed a number of years ago that focuses on central city census tracts that have below median household income and that have an older housing stock. And then we also use another metric that my co-author developed, which is similar, except they don't have a focus on the age of the housing stock. I had included the age of the housing stock because I thought that would be a way to capture older neighborhoods that have not had much new construction prior to gentrification. But the idea here is to use, try two different metrics and see, are the results consistent if we measure gentrification in these two different ways. So I would admit this is probably one of the more challenging one of the biggest methodological challenges working with a nationwide data set, attempting to identify neighborhoods that have experienced gentrification just using census data, right? Because the PSID is a national data set. We can't really rely on our local knowledge of a particular neighborhood. We kind of have to look at census indicators to try to parse out which neighborhoods are indeed experiencing gentrification. And so I would admit that that's probably one of the bigger methodological challenges. So the next step, once we have a set of neighborhoods that we could say have the potential to experience gentrification, they're gentrifiable, how do we define gentrification? So here, again, we use two different approaches. One that I developed some years ago. I focused on changes in the college-educated population and increases in housing values. And so my thinking was that gentrification is associated with upper and middle class households moving into an area. And so you might ask, well, why not just look at income? Income fluctuates a great deal from year to, or can fluctuate a great deal from year to year, whereas educational attainment is relatively stable. So I was trying to identify the neighborhoods where you see the biggest increase in college or educational attainment. The second measure that my co-author developed is similar, but they focus on, in addition to college education, they also include changes in median household income. So it could be an increase in education or income. And then they also look at increases in housing values or rents. Okay, so it's a little bit more inclusive than my measure, you could say. So that's how we identify gentrification. So again, as we do the analyses, I will repeat them once using my metric and a second time relying on the metric developed by my co-author. And then finally, the comparison neighborhood would be the non-gentrified neighborhoods. These are the neighborhoods that started in 2000, relatively low income, but over the ensuing years, they did not experience gentrification. Okay. And I should have said this in the beginning. If I can't really see the audience, but I guess if anyone has questions, maybe you could let me know as we go along.
Okay, yeah, I sorry about that. I mentioned this to the audience that I'll read off the questions after the chat, but given this, you're welcome to go ahead and post your question in the chat. I'll read it right away in that case, whenever I feel like I'm not interrupting. And Lance, we have 30 people in the audience, it looks like. And okay. Seth Swillman says hi, so does Colin Reed.
Yeah, I guess if there's a question particularly relevant to the methodology, right, a particular slide, you could bring it up right away. I guess if it's a more general question, we could wait to the end. I guess that makes sense.
Sounds good.
Okay, so this first slide shows the characteristics of the gentrifying neighborhoods versus the non-gentrifying neighborhoods. So the red bar indicates the percentage non-Hispanic white in 2000, and then the orange bar is the percentage non-Hispanic white in 2017. So the first two pairs of bars are neighborhoods that we classify as gentrifying and non-gentrifying using my metric. And so basically what the story is that the gentrifying neighborhoods, the white population is pretty flat, right? From 2000 to 2017. In the non-gentrifying neighborhood, the white population is declining, right? So there's a relative decline in the white population. And the story is pretty similar using my co-author Jackie Huang's measure of gentrification. The white population is actually increasing a little bit between 2000 and 2017, and the white population is declining in the non-gentrifying neighborhoods. So you could say certainly relatively, and in the case, depending on how you measure it, absolutely the white population is increasing in the gentrifying neighborhoods between 2000 and 2017. This next chart just shows the change in the non-Hispanic Black population, again, between 2000 and 2017. And
Dr. Freeman, folks are asking whether this is Colin Reed is asking across the whole US. I assume this is from the PSID survey, and that was done randomly across the US?
That's correct. It's from the PSID survey. Yep.
Thanks.
So the Black population, again, if you look at the first two pairs of bars, in the gentrifying neighborhoods, the Black population is declining. It declines. In the non-gentrifying neighborhoods, it's relatively flat. And I think a similar story, you could say a relatively similar story we tell if we look at gentrification measured using Jackie Huang's metric. The Black population declines in the gentrifying neighborhood and declines a little bit in the non-gentrifying neighborhoods also, but certainly not as much. Okay. All right, and then I'll share with you another indicator to give you a sense of the neighborhood conditions. The poverty rate in the gentrifying neighborhood, the poverty rate declines somewhat if you look at the first pair of bars. In the non-gentrifying neighborhood, the poverty rate is increasing. And we see a similar story if we look at the poverty rate using Jackie Huang's metric. in the gentrifying neighborhoods, the poverty rate declines somewhat. In the non-gentrifying neighborhoods, the poverty rate is increasing. And then the final metric looks at rents. And here we see that in the gentrifying neighborhoods, rents are increasing using my metric pretty substantially, and modestly in the non-gentrifying neighborhoods. Now, interestingly, in Jackie Huang's metric, the rents actually decline somewhat in the gentrifying neighborhoods, but not as much as the decline in the non-gentrifying neighborhoods. Okay. So altogether, the story told by the way we measured it, and again, as I admit that, admittedly, that's probably our biggest one of our biggest methodological challenges is really measuring gentrification. And so that's sort of a check. You could look at it and say, well, is that really capturing gentrification? Are those metrics consistent with what we would expect if neighborhoods were gentrifying? I think they are for the most part, but it is what it is. You could look at it and you may have your own questions about that. Okay, so going forward and thinking about what happens to people living there and displacement. So what we did here and what I did in this presentation, I separated the households into those that had above median household income and those that had below median household income. I also do another split where I divide the incomes into quartiles as well. But this is just sort of a rough way to try to get at the extent to which gentrification is impacting different households differently, right? Again, and the reason being, the concern about gentrification and displacement really tends to focus on low-income households, right? Households that don't have that much in the way of income, where we tend to be less concerned about, say, middle class or affluent households who happen to live in a gentrifying neighborhood, because the assumption is that they would not be at risk of being displaced because they have the resources to be able to handle increases in rent, or they may even own their own home and they may end up being better off after gentrification. Okay, so general methodological approach, as I had said previously, we're going to analyze households in the PSID. One, we'll look at residential mobility and compare, do we see more in the gentrifying neighborhoods compared to the non-gentrifying neighborhoods? The PSID also asks people why they moved. And so we can use that to get a sense of if they were displaced, if they give a reason that is consistent with displacement. And then the second part, we'll look at, what types of neighborhoods are people moving to in terms of a couple of socioeconomic characteristics. And so we use a logistic regression model. One model, the dependent variable is if the household moved or not. And in a second model, we have if they were displaced or not. And then our independent variable is whether or not the household is living in a gentrifying, non-gentrifying, or other neighborhood. And then we have in the right-hand panel, right side of the panel are the variables that we control for in terms of predicting if a household moves or it was displaced. Okay, so I'm just going to share with you the predicted probabilities from these logistic regression models. These were created using interaction terms, so we just predict the probability of a particular outcome for the different possible scenarios using the interaction terms. So we're interacting the household's income status with the type of neighborhood that they live in. And so I thought, using predictive probabilities illustrated in a chart might be an easier way to illustrate that. I'll cut to the chase. We don't really see a big difference in mobility rates. And if anything, the mobility rates are somewhat lower in the gentrifying neighborhoods. Okay, so you can see that in this first chart, where using my measure of gentrification, we have what's the predicted probability of household moving. The for low-income households, and again, we're really concerned about their vulnerability to displacement. The probability of them moving is actually lower if they're in a gentrifying neighborhood compared to a non-gentrifying neighborhood. If we use Jackie Huang's measure, here, again, we don't really see a difference in mobility rates for the low-income households. The predicted probability for the low-income households is pretty much the same if they're living in a gentrifying neighborhood or a non-gentrifying neighborhood. And so again, this is not consistent with gentrification really forcing people to move more quickly. It does, at least it's not showing up in this data, right? We're not seeing a difference in mobility rates. Now, as I mentioned, the PSID also asks people when they move, they say, well, why did you move? So we're able to classify their responses, right? So someone might say, well, I moved because my rent increased too much, or the land, I was evicted, or et cetera, et cetera. So we're actually able to try and tease out the households that, among those who did move, the ones who were displaced or who gave reasons that we might classify as displacement. And so again, here, we don't see, if you look at, again, focusing on the low-income households, the reasons that we would classify as consistent with displacement, they're not really higher. They're actually lower in the gentrifying neighborhoods, right? And you can see that looking at the red bar compared to the orange bar. We use Jackie Huang's measure. If we look at, again, focusing on the left side, which are the low-income households, we would think would be more vulnerable to displacement, they are somewhat more likely to be displaced, but the difference is not that substantial, right? It's 8.4% to 8.2%. So there's some evidence of greater displacement in the gentrifying neighborhoods, but substantively, it's not that great. And since we're relying on a sample, we take into consideration the confidence intervals, the differences are indistinguishable from zero. Okay, so that was the first part of our research question. Are households at greater risk of displacement or being forced to move in gentrifying neighborhoods? Our study does not turn up any evidence consistent with that. And it seems counterintuitive, but as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there have been a number of studies that also don't have a similar result. Happy to talk about why that might be, or how do we make sense of that in light of, I think, the common narrative that associates gentrification with widespread displacement. But just based on the findings presenting here, we don't see much evidence of that. So where are people going, right? So, that's another question. There are people that do move. So even if they're not necessarily moving more quickly, excuse me for a moment, if they are winding up in poorer neighborhoods or more disadvantaged neighborhoods or more segregated neighborhoods that could still have some important equity implications. So what we do here is we look at the households in terms of the destinations that they move to. Okay? And so this is a first cut. We compare, if you look at the left-hand panel, we look at the origin neighborhood. That's what the color signifies. And then the dollar values indicate the median household income of where they move. So if you compare, again, the gentrifying neighborhoods to the non-gentrifying neighborhoods, that's sort of a counterfactual. The low-income households leaving gentrifying neighborhoods they're not really moving to neighborhoods that are poorer than low-income households who leave non-gentrifying neighborhoods, right? So this is one way of looking at it. We could also compare the where they go to where they're coming from as another way of trying to get at this question, but just for today, focusing on where they're going, it doesn't look like the people leaving the gentrifying neighborhoods are moving to worse off neighborhoods. And I think a similar story could be told using Jackie Huang's measure, again, focusing on the left-hand side of the panel, which are the low-income households. The median household incomes of those leaving the gentrifying neighborhoods, which is illustrated by the red bar, it's not really any different than those leaving the non-gentrifying neighborhoods, right? So in other words, they're moving to neighborhoods that are similar in terms of the socioeconomic status, at least as measured by median household income. And then we also looked at the poverty rate using a similar approach. The idea, again, is to compare households leaving the gentrifying neighborhoods to households leaving the non-gentrifying neighborhoods, and again, focusing on the lower income households on the left side of the panel. The poverty rates of the neighborhoods of people who are leaving the gentrifying neighborhoods are not really any higher than the poverty rates of people leaving the non-gentrifying neighborhoods. And this is also a similar story can be told when we use Jackie Huang's measure of gentrification. The poverty rate is a little bit higher. It's about one percentage point higher. But overall, in terms of comparing people leaving gentrifying neighborhoods to people leaving non-gentrifying neighborhoods, the neighborhoods are similar in terms of socioeconomic status, the neighborhoods of where people move to, okay? And then the final metric I include is distance from the central business district. And so what we're trying to get at here is the extent to which gentrification is pushing people out of the central cities, right? And so we measure that using the distance in miles from the centroid of the central business district to the centroid of the destination tract that the household moves to. In this case, I divided the incomes of the households into quartiles. And so again, the way to make sense of these numbers, if we look at the first 4 bars, so these are households who are in the lowest quartile in terms of the income distribution in the PSID. The bars, the color bars indicate the type of neighborhood that they originated from and then where they moved, okay? So the gentrifiers, they went from tracts that were about 16.3 miles away from the central business district to census tracts that are 16.9 miles away from the central business district. So they are moving slightly further out, right? Because 16.9 is further away than 16.3. And if you compare that to the non-gentrifiers, it's a little bit different. You don't really see that pattern, right? It goes from 21.2 to 21, right? So there is some evidence that poor households, if they originate in a gentrifying neighborhood, when they do move, they end up moving a little bit further away from the downtown. So that is consistent with them being pushed out. Whether or not you would interpret that, that's what, 0.6 of a mile. Would you interpret that as a really substantive distance? That's debatable, but it is consistent with them being pushed out. You also see something similar if you look at the second from the left, the second bar, lower, what I classify as lower middle class households. These would be in the second quartile. They also, when they move, they're a little bit further away. They go from 23.8 miles to 25 miles away, right? So again, that's also consistent with these households being pushed further away from the central business district. And this next panel repeats the exercise using Jackie Huang's measure of gentrification. And again, I'll focus on the poor and lower middle class, which are the two poorest quartiles in the income distribution. And again, if you look at poor households that are moving from a gentrifying tract, they start out about 17.1 miles away from the central business district, and they end up moving someplace that is 18.5 miles away. And a similar story is told when we look at the lower middle class, right? They start out 27.7 miles away from the central business district, and they move someplace at 30.1 miles away. So particularly compared to households that are leaving non-gentrifying tracts and also more affluent households, you don't see that similar pattern. So, again, whether or not that's a really could be considered a substantial difference, I guess is debatable, but there is some evidence that poorer households, when they do move, they are moving further away from the core of the city. Okay, so tentative conclusions. I should also preface, I should have said this in the beginning, we're still working on this research, so we haven't completed it yet. So definitely welcome any suggestions or comments that you have. But overall, we're not finding evidence consistent with widespread displacement, right? They're not moving more frequently, and the reasons that they give for moving are no more likely to be considered displacement. And then if we look at where they go, in terms of socioeconomic status, we don't really see a big difference in terms of the socioeconomic status of the neighborhoods. And then finally, we do see some evidence, though, that people leaving gentrifying neighborhoods are moving further out, right? So that's consistent with a pattern that's more typically found in European cities where the poor tend to live on the periphery. So there is some evidence that gentrification is consistent with that. What would we like to look at in the future? Where are the gentrifiers coming from? Are they coming from the suburbs, other high income neighborhoods? We also would like to look at where people move in terms of, are they moving to the suburbs? So instead of just measure it in Cartesian distance, but is it a different jurisdiction? How far away are they moving from their origin neighborhood? Are they moving closer to jobs? And then also, what are the implications for racial and ethnic segregation? That's something else that we have not had an opportunity to look at yet. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to take any additional questions that you might have at this time, at this moment. I'm happy that I had an opportunity to share this research with you.
Thanks a whole lot, Dr. Freeman. This was really fascinating. I was especially interested in some parts myself, but I see questions in the chat. There's a 20 seconds lag between us and YouTube. Folks, please go ahead and share your questions up there. Good news is that Dr. Freeman has agreed for this talk to stay online. Same link on YouTube. The Q&A will also stay online. I have a couple of questions about the data, and I think I want to preface, I'm adding this myself. Is the PSID collected across the entire US, or is this only in the metropolitan statistical areas, for instance? I was just wondering, especially when you were showing those charts, and I was wondering the difference between the sample size of gentrified versus non-gentrified. And then I'll build on that to ask the next questions.
Yes, that's a great question. So it's supposed to be representative of the entire country, so that would include rural and suburban and urban. Now, one thing that has happened since they started it, there has been significant immigration into the US, and so they have tried to include sort of an immigrant subsample, but because of the timing of when they did that, we were not able to include it in our study. So, so for example, Hispanics tend to be underrepresented in the survey because, you know, in the 1960s, their population was much smaller relatively to blacks and whites than it is now. Same thing for Asians, for example.
That's actually interesting you bring that up, because the next question from Seth Spielman was actually that, let me find it, that the PSID was representative of the US when it was created in the late 1960s, but concerns have been raised about how well it represents the US currently. Wondering if you think that might impact the results. Some samples were added in the late 90s, which I think you're touching on now.
Yeah. Do I think it impacts the results? I mean, it could. Yeah, I mean, it could. I mean, I guess I would say, though, that, you know, other studies that have used other data sets have reached similar conclusions. But we also know that at least a substantial segment of the immigrant population is undocumented, and so I imagine the PSID doesn't do a good job of capturing that group. So yeah, probably, you know, it probably does. I don't know how it. Yeah, I guess yes. Yes, it probably does affect the results in some way. But yeah, until we figure out how to you know, measure the undocumented population, I'm not sure the direction of the bias, but it's probably there to some extent.
Right, and you know, the perpetual struggle of dealing with data and its deficiencies. Dr. Colleen Reed is saying it will be interesting to see a map of neighborhoods identified as gentrifying and not gentrifying, and if there are characteristics that differ between the two. So that's her first question. And then the second one is, I'm wondering if these national findings would show different things for different cities, so let's say by geographic region or economic trends. So those are the two questions by Colleen Reed.
Yeah, so the I don't have maps right at the moment. I agree that would be an interesting addition, something that we have talked about, including some maps. So I think that could be helpful. The second question about the economic conditions, we did attempt to look at the housing market, right? So we do have the vacancy rate, and we did try some other models looking at you know, changes in housing prices. Other economic indicators, I guess, could also be something to consider. But yeah, we have tried looking at different aspects of the housing market and how that might affect the changes. But you know, the results I shared with you included the vacancy rate. I believe that's the only housing market indicator we have in the results that I shared with you.
Thank you. And before I ask the next question, I was just going to add my own comment, whether some of these counterintuitive results that you see might be perhaps due to the American Community Survey. And how, so if I understood correctly, you're looking at, let's say, median household income that is collected throughout the 5-year period after your initial, let's say, 2010 census tract. Again, if I understood the dates right. And I'm wondering if there is a lag by which we actually see a shift in the neighborhood's median household income, and whether that may have any effect in what the patterns you're observing. And then I'll ask the next question.
Yeah, so yeah, you're right. So we're using the American Community Survey at the census tract level is relying on a 5-year average. So we have the latest wave we have is 2013 to 2017. And yes, it certainly could introduce some measurement error in terms of the way we classify the census tracts, right? If the neighborhood is, we might say it's not gentrifying, but it really is because we didn't pick up enough of the latter years, or we say it's gentrifying, but it's not. So that's certainly possible. I'm not, yeah, I mean, it's something, yeah, I'm not, it's certainly, so definitely could affect the measurement error. There definitely could be some measurement error. I don't know if there's reason to think it would be systematic or if it would just be noise. I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that. I'm happy if you have some ideas about why it might bias the results in a particular direction. I'd be happy to hear them. I'd have to think about that some more, though.
Yeah.
Other than to recognize that, yes, it probably does introduce some noise because we have this 5-year average.
Yeah, and Seth Spillman, if you're still on, perhaps feel free to leave a comment. I know you've been thinking about those too. I was just wondering if actually, after the gentrifying and non-gentrifying neighborhoods are identified, and where they're moving to, and looking at the median household income, the new median household income of those neighborhoods is where I was thinking perhaps there might be a lag in updating. The next question is, I'd love to hear more about, Catherine Tyler asking, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on why gentrification isn't causing displacement despite the predominant narrative. I just read the question as is.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a number of things going on, right? So one is the prevailing narrative, right? Which you see a neighborhood changing and people look different. The gentrifiers look different, right? And so, and that's true, right? But not all of that change is necessarily due to displacement, right? Because neighborhoods are dynamic, right? People don't live in the same place for their entire life. So if you look at a neighborhood and it doesn't look like it's changing, it doesn't mean it's because people haven't been moving in and out. It just means that the people who are moving in now are different than the people who are moving out. So I think that's part of it. I think people pick up on the change when the people coming in are different. And so then it's easier, perhaps psychologically or in terms of perception, to make that connection. Oh, the people who were there before aren't there, so they were displaced. But if you look at another neighborhood that looks the same, really what happened is some people have left, but they have been replaced by similar people or people who look the same. So I think that's part of it. I also think, the neighborhoods that are gentrifiable probably have a fair amount of turnover in the first place, right? Because they tend to be relatively low income. And we know lower income households tend to move more frequently, although that's changing somewhat. And we know renters tend to move more frequently. There's also some evidence that people move more in poorer neighborhoods than in other neighborhoods. So I think when you combine those together, you have a lot of churn in low-income neighborhoods. And that's one thing that we're doing, right? We're comparing the low-income gentrifying neighborhoods to other low-income neighborhoods. So, you would expect to see a fair amount of churn in these neighborhoods anyway. And so the gentrification doesn't seem to be elevating that churn. It's just the people who are coming in are different. Now, some people or some researchers also make a distinction between direct displacement, as those are people who had to move out of their units, and secondary displacement, in other words, the people who otherwise would have moved into the neighborhood if it had not experienced gentrification. So some people make that distinction. And so they would say that even if the people who were living there were not moving any more quickly, the fact that the people coming in are different that is also displacement. I'm hesitant to define displacement that broadly because that also makes assumptions about migration at a larger level that I don't necessarily think is that helpful in terms of understanding some of the important equity implications of gentrification. But some people do define it that way.
Thanks very much, folks. We are at the top of the hour. I'll ask this last two questions, but we'll wrap up in 5 minutes maximum. So and the question that came in, does the PSID account for the uneven development of the housing across the country that may skew the findings?
Well, remember we merged the PSID with the American Community Survey. So the changes in the local housing markets should be picked up by the American Community Surveys. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but if I'm understanding it, then that's the way right? So the American Community Survey, which is a household or housing unit-based survey, should pick up changes in the housing market. And so we merged the two together. So the PSID itself is a family-based survey. It's not a house. So in that way, it's different than the census survey, right? Census uses a list of addresses and that's how they survey people. PSID uses these families that they're following over time. They're not following housing units. So I hope that answers your question, but if not.
I think it does, and they're welcome to ask a question again. Last question by Andy Gates, if I'm reading your last name right. Thank you for the great talk. Did you detect any differences in displacement effects in transit-oriented development areas?
Well, we did not try to identify transit-oriented areas. And yeah, I mean, I guess we might be able to do it. I'm not sure. I mean, that's one challenge of working with a national data set. We need a measure of transit-oriented development that we could link up with census tracts. I'm not sure. If you know of a data set, feel free to email me. lf182@columbia.edu. I'm not sure if there's such a data set, but that's what we would need, right? We would need to know the census tract of all the transit-oriented developments in the country to be able to do that. That's an interesting point because that's something else people are concerned about. Does transit-oriented development spur displacement?
Well, thank you, Dr. Freeman. There's lots of thank yous in chat. Thanks everyone for tuning in at a different time. And I know Dr. Freeman had a school district cost conflict. Again, thank you for accommodating this talk.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
This was really fascinating. Folks, next week at noon Mountain Time, please tune in for a talk by Dr. Monica Hooper, Deputy Director of National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities of the National Institutes of Health. The talk is Racial and Ethnic Disparities in the Age of COVID-19, Heightened Emphasis on long-lasting problems. I'll see you all next week. In the meanwhile, stay safe and well. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone. Thanks for having me.